Welcome to Learning Aloud, a podcast from the Organizational Dynamics community at the University of Pennsylvania, produced to inspire purposeful leadership practice and transform organizational experience. I am your host, Stephen G. Hart.
My guest today is Jason Magidson. Jason helps organizations create thriving workplaces where 1 + 1 = 3. These are workplaces where people feel most alive, appreciated, challenged, and proud of their impact. They're places where a collaborative, proactive culture helps make the world better. In his years-long research for approaches that lead to more meaningful, impactful results, Jason identified and combined practices from multiple fields, producing a powerful approach to employee and user engagements in transformation. Jason has used these practices to deliver extraordinary results for organizations including GlaxoSmithKline, Amazon, AmeriHealth Caritas, SAP, Merck, Penn Law School, IKEA, and Jones Lang LaSalle. In his current role as business process engineer at AmeriHealth Caritas, Jason has engaged more than 1,000 employees, caregivers, patients, healthcare providers, nonprofit leaders, and government officials in process redesign, transformation, employee engagement, and/or cultural transformation. Jason has written 3 books. His latest book, Engaged, covers 25 practices for creating a thriving organization. Earlier, Jason co-authored Idealized Design, Dissolving Tomorrow's Crisis Today with Russell Akoff and Herb Addison. To balance out his business books, Jason wrote the humor book, Laughter is the Salt of Life. He's produced articles in Harvard Business Review, Journal of Product Innovation Management, and Journal of Business Strategy. Jason received a BS in Business Administration from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD in Systems Thinking and Interactive Management from Union Institute and University. Jason has stopped by our Zoom room today to talk about his work and his latest book. So Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Jason, in the foreword of your latest book, Engaged, your friend and colleague, Jerry Brandyberry, writes, when asked about their most important asset, most corporate leaders instinctively respond, it's our people. But is it really? When employees are asked if they believe they are the most valuable asset, their responses range from loud laughter to acute nausea to pure anger. Why do you think so many corporate leaders get this wrong?
Well, it's funny that you talk about the foreword to the book because I sent him a copy of the advanced manuscript, and as he was getting ready to think about the foreword, and he read one of my lists in my book. It was actually a top 10 list of to tell whether you're engaged or disengaged, and I tried to work some humor into the book too. So he had his people laughing at some of the different statements in that list. And for example, one of them was that if I find out that like my boss has canceled a meeting or my boss is called out sick or something isn't going to be in the office or maybe he's gone on a trip, I feel delighted and stuff like that. So that was one of the ones where he was having some fun with it with some of the employees. And in that same room, in the conference room at the company where he was, which I will not identify, they had posters on the wall saying how great it was to work in that company. And so they found it humorous, and they also kind of had some anger about like the situation. I mean, there's humor, but there's also a dark side of that humor, which is kind of like an anger about different things that are going on. So, for instance, management might have little interest in hearing what you have to think. You might feel like you're a passenger in the back seat of a car and it's going in a direction where like that's not where we should be going, but you really can't control it. And it might be risky to do that in that environment, to speak up and say, hey, this is wrong direction. You kind of almost have to wait it out. So I think that there's a lot of times a disconnect that limits the engagement in companies. And we know that from research that engagement is very low. There's like the classic Gallup study every year where they find less than a third of the people are engaged. And so I think, the thing is, if management could get connected with some of those things, there's really a lot of ways that they could improve the situation. So yeah, it was kind of interesting to see that connection that he was making with the reality and what people are feeling working in the organization and what the management perceives.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I love what I love about your book is how practical I think it is. And you write that much has been written about the relationship between employee engagement and business performance, but much less about specific actions to improve it. So why do you think creating strong, sustainable engagement of employees in our organizations has been so elusive? And what do you think are some of the examples of the practical advice you offer in your book to remedy that?
Sure. Well, that's an easier question to ask than to answer. And I think that one of the reasons it's so hard to get good engagement, or that disengagement is prevalent, is that it's systemic. And if we look to what's going on in our society today, I know, like, we're looking at essentially systemic racism, and maybe before some of these incidents that we've had recently with some of these, like the Minneapolis incident with George Floyd and his murder, you could speak about systemic racism, but you didn't necessarily have like the majority of Americans really appreciating or understanding like what you're talking about. And I think that's like dramatically shifted. And people are really understanding that there's systemic racism. There's reasons why that, if you're a person of color, why you're not able to thrive, or it's much harder to do that. And I hesitate to compare that to engagement, but it's akin to that, because there's a number of systemic factors in organizations that make it hard to get sustainable engagement, as you were talking about. So some of those include like fragmentation of organizations as they grow. They start out, they're very dynamic when they're young, but then they split out into divisions and they grow, and then they're fragmented and it's hard to get things done. There's also something about the tribal nature of human groups, and maybe that has to do with the prehistory and just being able to survive and band together in tough environments. So there's that, and then if you haven't bridged those tribes, so to speak, in your organization, then you're having conflict and you're not getting collaboration, so you're not getting impact. So then people are then disengaged because they feel like they're not making a difference. Sometimes you have incentives that pull people away from their intrinsic motivations, and human beings are creatures that are intrinsically motivated. They really want to make a difference, but sometimes they're pulled in other directions where they're not really satisfied. So that's another reason for disengagement. There could be maldistribution of power and resources in the organization, like a few people have the power and other people are more on the margins, so they can become disengaged. There's also implicit bias, which we can talk a little bit more later about, people not even realizing that they're disengaging other people by not including them. So maybe I could go on and on, but maybe that would be enough to give you a flavor.
Yeah, really great examples. But one of the key overwhelming themes arising for me after reading your book is the notion of leaders working hard to be what I would call intentionally inclusive in the way that they lead. So tell me more about why that's important, and what are some ways leaders can master that skill?
So it's interesting because one of the chapters, I was actually going to have a guest author, who was one of the leaders in the diversity of the organization, and that person turns out they got another job, and they're like, I'm too busy in a new job to do it. So I ended up having to write that the chapter, on the implicit bias and inclusion, and so I had to do a lot of research and reading, and it was really interesting to find out about this idea of implicit bias, or you're not really even aware of it. And there could be like, you could be a leader. You don't even have to be a leader. You could be like someone kind of low down in the organization, or you don't have to have people reporting to you, but you might have certain views of things you're not even maybe conscious of, that you're excluding other people. And there's many different facets of that. There could be, there's the one that we talked about, like it could be color of the skin or something like that, but there could also be like age, there could be accent, there could be ethnic background, there could be height, could be a reason to do it. There could be educational background, socioeconomic class. So there's just different factors, and you could be like a fish in water. You just don't realize that you're in the water. And so there are some things where, you could be, limiting people by not being aware. So if you start to realize that those could be some considerations, you can do some things to start changing your patterns and say, okay, well, let me try doing this. I'm now going to, outreach to more people and, get involvement. And there's interesting ways that you can do that. So I'll talk a little bit more about it probably a little bit later, but there's this concept of a volunteer army where you're trying to do something. You would then open that up and say, whoever is interested in being involved in solving this problem or whatever it is, make it be known, come forward, and then you get involved. So instead of you kind of picking, like, who would be good? Like, would Steve be a good person for this? You'd say, like, well, let me open that up to Jason also, or the whole group. And then you'd be surprised sometimes people who are intrinsically motivated to do a certain thing, they'll step forward, and then you'll change your view of them because they're going to start performing, and then they'll get engaged through that process.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. In my experience working and coaching in the area of employee engagement for many years in several organizations, it seems that the best place to start and inspire productively engaged employees in your organization is to ensure you have the right culture. So how important is it to pay attention to and understand your organization's culture before you work on other engagement strategies?
So, Steve, that's really, really important because getting successful change and engagement often requires not only understanding the culture, but changing the culture as part of that effort. And there's a saying that I've heard various different forms of it. One is like, culture eats strategies, lunch, things like that, So what I found is that it's really important to focus on culture, but you can build that into the change effort in your methodology for getting change, which then gets engagement. And as I mentioned, groups of humans are tribal, and so that's like almost like a default culture, and the best leaders are able to bring those cultures together. So the prevalent culture in the United States is I'm great and you're not, and that's maybe a majority of organizations where there's a tendency for, like, on the individual level, for someone to kind of want to excel and like promote themselves and advance their careers, or departmental, where the departments are not really collaborating properly, and which then that of course leads to poor engagement and then leads to disengagement. So if you can shift that to like a we're great together type culture, or we're changing the world type culture, that's a really key thing. And there's ways to do that, actually. One example is, I'll give you from Pixar. They do this thing when they review their movies to make sure they can strengthen them. They do this thing called Notes Day, where they get together and they review and they have really serious criticism of, like, say, a plot line for the movie. They attack it. So other people come in, they attack it, and then they say this needs to be strengthened, or this character is not really good. And I think with Toy Story, with Woody, he had a dark character, and then they changed that to more of a uplifting type character through that process. Well, they took that process because they had a big problem. They had grown, and they found that they had too many people hours or people weeks per movie. So they had a goal of reducing that by 10% without having any layoffs. So one of the VPs suggested that they do like a Notes Day process where they open it up to the whole company, and I think it was like 995 people at the time participated. Mm-hmm. They planned this in advance where they were going to shut down for a day, and they would do all kinds of brainstorming on how to reduce those costs. So they were dealing with the executive team's problem by coming up with asking everybody in the company. And so that months ahead of time, they solicited ideas, people sent them in, and they didn't do it too complicated. They just said, send them in by email to this person, and that person managed it. They figured out, like, what are the different categories, and they came up with the groups. And then they came up with kits, like, write down the top ideas, who should present the idea to leadership, who should be the champion for it. And so those teams on that day, they shut the company down, they took a whole day, they had all these groups, and then they came up with all kinds of ideas. And some of them were just really kind of surprising. Like one of them cost no money. It was like this thing, they had like a lunch lottery where people could, they would just get somebody, they would have lunch with someone they didn't know from another area. So then that would like build a relationship, and that breaks down those tribal barriers. And then they would be collaborating, and then they would come up with ideas to be more integrated rather than fragmented, which then adds cost to the process of making the movie. So that was one thing. And then as I referenced before, this idea of a volunteer army, which actually comes from John Cotter, the change management professor from Harvard, which is just a brilliant concept, where you get people, they have their day job. You don't disturb the current org chart, but you come up with a new org chart that's kind of like superimposed on that, where people can interact cross-functionally on teams they volunteer for. So they do their day job. They have to do their day job well, but then they can be on these other teams as a reward for doing their day job. And then they make other improvements and things like that. And then they're working through that process. So they're simultaneously starting to change the culture while they make improvements at the same time. And we had something where I currently work at Ameriho Caritas, where we intentionally thought that we could improve engagement and make improvements, process improvements at the same time for performance. And we actually ended up measuring before and after. We improved the employee engagement by 35%, which is extremely high and unusual to be able to move the needle that much.
Wow, that's incredible. And one of the parts of your book, I believe it's part 6, really spoke to me in this respect. That that section is, I think, titled "Freedom and Accountability." And the dilemma that I think many leaders have is how much control should they give up to their employees to do the work, when the leader, him or herself, is ultimately accountable for the outcome. So how do you solve this dilemma for leaders, and what are some of the things that leaders can do to loosen that grip they might have on their strong desire to be in control all the time and allow their employees more task autonomy?
All right, so that's a great question. Again, that's easier to ask than to answer, but because there's many dimensions to that. I think that one of the concepts I learned from one of my mentors, Russell Ackoff, who was a management thinker and theorist from the 20th century, is one of the greats in the 20th century. He had this concept of power to do versus power over. And he had many examples of people that had power over people, like the Shah of Iran had tremendous power over, what he considered his subjects, but very little power to do things. So he was very, very frustrated person in terms of the impact that he was able to make. So there's this concept of having a power to do things. And that ties into another concept of this idea of servant leadership. And that's a concept that was identified and recognized from Robert Greenleaf, who worked for AT&T. He read a novel by Herman Hesse. The novel was called Journey to the East. And in that novel, there's a servant, and they go on this journey, and the servant's doing all these things to help make the journey successful. People need resources, they need the food, the cooking, and all this. And the servant does all this work and does it very humbly. And then one day, the servant mysteriously disappears, and nobody knows what happened. But then they try to continue on, but then this journey, it falls apart. And it turns out the servant had, really been the glue that had made the thing happen. So years later, one of the people that was on the journey runs into the servant and says, what happened? And tells him kind of what happened to the journey too. And the servant reveals that he had actually been the person who had organized and sponsored the journey and everything, and was like the servant to make sure it would happen. So he had been there supporting the whole thing along the way. And so Robert Greenleaf read this and realized that's the model that you should have for leaders. You should be like the servant to make things happen, rather than the person that's controlling. And so that's like a different paradigm. And maybe if you have the controlling thing and people are disengaged, then the manager's gonna be like, I need to control these people even more. It's kind of like the phrase, the beatings will continue until morale improves,
Right.
Which is totally crazy, of course.
Yeah.
But so it's kind of a shift. So the role is more like inspiring and supporting people rather than controlling them. And then also there's companies that give people the freedom and the accountability. So it's not just a matter of giving people like freedom to do things and then they're not accountable and then you lose control of your organization. They kind of go hand in hand. So an example would be a company called MetalX, Specialty Metals, a company that they do engineering of metals for like spaceships and like rockets and things. And like they post projects and people can volunteer to be on the projects. And then they sign up and then so they're pursuing their passion. Then at the end of the year, they're evaluated by their peers and other people. And then they, if they're not performing, then they wouldn't stay in the organization, but they love it. And they, a lot of people thrive in that. There's other companies that are looking at, there's even organizations that are non-businesses, like there's schools. I'm familiar with the school that I've been involved with in Philadelphia. It's called Philly Free School. And there's no required curriculum. The students are free to pursue their passions. And it might sound a little crazy, like, well, how are they going to learn this and that? But by pursuing things they're really interested in, they're much more serious about it. And then they pursue those and they don't have to be controlled. They have the accountability of like whether they waste their time or it's their life to kind of be proactive and take control. So in those environments, when you change the environment, maybe it takes a little time, but you can have people become proactive and then the managers don't have to worry about the control. And that's especially important, like in this environment when like probably the majority of us, are working from home. And then there's people that are not working from home that I have a huge amount of respect for. They're on the front lines and while we're dealing with the pandemic. But most of us are at home. I think most of us are at home and, it's a different model. And so maybe that's something that'll help kind of promote some of those things that you were asking about.
Yeah. Another aspect of the book that really resonated with me is, I think it's chapter 19. You advocate for leaders to change their mindset in the way they facilitate the development of people. And in my experience, this is such an incredible tool to inspire engagement in people, but I think it really matters how you go about that process. So what's your advice for leaders on how best to use development opportunities and experiences for people to help them grow and remain invested and engaged in their work and their organization?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'd like to answer that with a couple of stories and kind of weave them together. So one of them actually goes back to the 1960s and it involves, again, one of my mentor, Russell Acuff, who's just really amazing person. But he had seen this study coming out of the Small Business Administration in the 60s that they had this program where they were supporting these small businesses, entrepreneurs, and he read that they had shut down this program involving Black businesses because they had a 50% failure rate of those businesses. And that sounds like, wow, 50% failure rate, maybe shut it down. But then Acuff wasn't satisfied with that because he was familiar that there was a higher percent failure of businesses. And so it was actually the white businesses were failing at 70% rate. And so he's like, there's something going on here where that's limiting the success of the Black entrepreneurs. And so what happened was that the whites would fail more often, but then with entrepreneurship, a lot of times your second or third one is the one that's more successful because you learn from the failures and then you then are able to then succeed and go on to more development. So Acuff kind of made the leap of concept to say development, the ability to fail is really important, the opportunity to fail. And so there was in some sense an aspect of systemic racism because Blacks were prevented from having the ability to fail. So those entrepreneurs weren't getting the opportunity to go to their next and get the capital. So he was suggesting we have to shift it so that you have opportunities to fail, non-fatal failures. But then you learn through that, and then you become better and better. And so organizations, if they have that, they're going to be able to thrive if they do tolerate and they actually accept and reward failure. So one great example is Jeff Bezos. There's a famous thing with the Fire Phone. The Fire Phone is considered a failure. But, Jeff Bezos has hired this guy, Ian Freed, who was his technical assistant, who went on, he did this 2 out of 3 projects. One was the Echo, one was the Kindle, and one was a Fire Phone. But essentially, he was one of the leaders of the Fire Phone, and that failed. And Jeff Bezos was like, don't lose a minute of sleep over this. And Ian Freed had introduced the the technology that became incorporated into Alexa as part of that process in the Fire Phone. And then that stuff was taken and then that was put into Alexa, which is a runaway huge success. So Jeff Bezos was saying, if you're not failing, you're not tolerating failure, you're not going to have the levels of success. You're not going to have those big bets like the Amazon Prime that enable you to go to the next level, or the Amazon Web Services. So back to Akoff, he had this concept of development being the central purpose of organizations. And his definition of development was an increase in one's ability and desire to satisfy their own legitimate needs and desires and those of others. So if you could, be able to promote that by learning, you could then, you have the failures, and then people can increase their own ability and desire to help themselves through their failures and stuff like that. So basically, we need to create environments where people can take risks. And when we don't have those environments, you have disengagement, because they want a certain level of challenge that's within it stretches them, but not too far. But if they're not being challenged and they don't have purpose, then they're disengaged too. So you need something that's going to be enough to have them keep being challenged. And if you don't have that environment where you have development and failure tolerance, you're not going to get that. So that's kind of the thing, kind of weaving together. Again, it's another systemic type thing that is a reason why it's sometimes hard to move the needle on engagement.
Yes, and there's another piece of advice in your book that I think goes right along with that is, I love the title of it, Assume You Were Wrong. I think you're really describing a mindset here for leaders to pay attention to what's needed to drive engagement rather than be enforcing their own ideas. But how do leaders learn to use this skill? And sounds to me like it requires quite a bit of humility and an ability to listen. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. This comes back to something I learned earlier in my career when I was in my 20s. I was doing a pro bono project. I was working for a boutique consulting firm. I was doing a pro bono project at this elementary school, William Cramp Elementary School in North Philadelphia. And I had this idea. I was going to go in there and, suggest all these ideas on what they should do to improve their school. And fortunately, I went with somebody who was older and wiser than me to the project, this guy named Herman Rice, who was a brilliant community development person and activist in Philadelphia. So we went to the meeting, and fortunately, there was the principal and some teachers and some parents. I think it was mostly mothers, and they had some ideas that they wanted to do this community fair in the school in order to, raise money and support the teachers, give them resources that they needed to do a better job, materials in the classroom, things like that. So they started talking about that. I didn't have an opportunity to suggest my ideas. And then Herman Rice said, "That's brilliant. We're going to totally support you in doing that." So fortunately, I didn't have any say in terms of saying, we're going to do this. And then it turns out that this thing was a huge success. We had this fair, and they had dunking booths and foods and different games like ring toss and all kinds of stuff. That they made the games and stuff, a lot of them. They had a bake sale. They raised a few $1,000s, and then they loved it. And then when I had my ideas later on the next time, they were totally open to it. So I built this relationship, and that wouldn't have happened if I had come in with my own preconceived ideas. And then I kind of tried to draw that to management and stuff, and saying, you got to give your employees ideas. And it's related to some other things too, where if you're a hugely customer-centric organization and you're getting ideas, then the manager can also be listening to the customers and the employees. And again, kind of back to Amazon, one of the reasons they're one of the most successful companies is that they're hugely customer-centric. And I have some stories about that, but I don't think we have time to go into all that stuff today.
Yeah. So I love the way that you're describing the way in which leaders and customers are working together to create a vision and a view for what's possible. But we're recording this interview in the middle of a global pandemic, as you know, and some organizations are contemplating a possible return to the physical workspace, while others might remain permanently at home. So I'm sure that the effects of the pandemic and working from home has changed the equation a bit on how we feel and think about creating engagement in our organizations. So How have you been thinking about that in terms of your own workplace, as well as your role as an author and consultant?
Sure. Well, since I'm also working from home, I've had a lot of time to think about this.
Experiential.
Basically, yeah. basically, humans are social animals. We crave connections with others, and it's really hard for us to be isolated in our homes. And I think that's one of the reasons we see a lot of people coming out now after a few months. And unfortunately, it's still pretty dangerous, situation. But we need meaning, we need purpose, we need connection, we need achievable challenge, as I was referencing before. So I think it's even more important now with organizations to have engagement, for people to feel part of something significant and intrinsically rewarding, and then feel connected at the same time with others while doing this. So I think that it means that we have to have organizations where people are working more collaboratively. And I think that if we have an intense focus on serving others, like our customers or our constituencies, if we're not like a corporation or something like that, we need to really identify like what's going to make a difference, involve those people in saying what they want, like have a channel open, like what do you really need from us? If you're deep inside an organization and you're not interfacing directly with external customers, find a customer that's internally and serve them super well. And then you feel like you're having more of an impact. So there's things like changing the culture. And what's really interesting is before I thought it would be, you have to do a lot of stuff face to face. And I think that's still true. And unfortunately, we have like video with like Zoom and things like that and other things that really help a lot. But I realized by necessity that you can do a lot of make connections and do culture change over conference calls and video conferences, because that's really what we have available to us at the moment. So you can make those connections. And I think that the organizations that can capitalize on that understanding will be the ones that are more likely to thrive.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, being in the same situation, working from home and not being able to be out with clients and customers and so on that I'm normally out with, or even with students at the university. It's been interesting. But one of the things I've been reading about lately, and perhaps arising from the pandemic, is that need for leaders to make this mind shift from thinking about driving engagement and more closely deepening the relationship with their employees to create what a lot of authors are calling a sense of belonging. So I'm wondering what you think of this, and what advice would you give leaders on how to do it?
Yeah, belonging is super important. And unfortunately, I think for maybe the majority of people, they don't feel like, maybe they don't feel like they belong in the organizations, and that might seem odd, but they might implicitly be excluded. So it might not even be intentional. Managers, people are ambitious and they want to promote themselves while making an impact. And so they might not realize, the leadership might not realize that there's people that are just feeling like, I wish they would listen to me. I wish they would engage me and get my input. So things like where you have like problem solving with, leadership asks people in the organization to get involved in those things is really neat. One of the things like where I work right now at America Caritas is we have a number of initiatives, and they're actually looking for initiative owners to advance these things or actually offer ideas and things. So people are coming forward and getting engaged in making changes and making improvements that are, helping us with our bottom line. So I think that what we're doing there, and also some of the things like the volunteer army, which I do talk about kind of extensively in the book, that's really important. I think also there's this concept of, there's a great company in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a food company called Zingerman's, and they have this way that they do visions where they paint a picture of what it looks like at some point in the future. And it could be like a year in the future, depending on if it's a department or a company or division. It could be 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future, but they paint a picture of what they're proud of at that point in the future. And they write a narrative in the present tense of what it looks like, as if you've already arrived. So they just talk about all the things they're proud of, that as if it's in place. And so that's another thing that helps create belonging. It's like a shared, exciting, stimulating vision of something that's inspiring, that's, again, connected to someone that you're serving either internally or externally in your environment, that you're making a difference. Because I think ultimately, from my research and practice, people want to they want to make a difference. They want to make an impact at the workplace. And when you're feeling like you're not making an impact, you don't feel valuable intrinsically. You might be being paid and you might feel a little guilty, like I'm getting paid this money, but I'm not really delivering what I could. And I think in organizations, there's a huge percentage of people that are like, their potential is only being used in the single digits of what they could be doing. So I think that managers can make a shift. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is it has 25 things you can do to create that. So I wanted to have like a kind of like an a la carte. If this doesn't work in your organization, pick these other things, but pick a few things. And the more you do, the more impact.
Yeah, the book is full of great wisdom, and it was a fantastic read. And thanks so much for writing it and for helping to guide leaders in this process. But we usually end our shows now with some questions that we ask our guests. And you have not seen these in advance, and this is just a way for us to get a bit of insight into who you might be as a person. So I'm going to ask you some questions. Yeah, I'm going to ask you some questions. Ask you just give me a brief answer to them, preferably not just one word, but if you have some thoughts around it, we'd welcome that too. So question number one, what is one thing you would most like to do in your life that you have not yet done?
That's a great question. Like this doesn't really involve work per se, but I would like to be able to do more travel. I'd like to see other cultures in other parts of the world. I think I could tie it back into work. If we could have like sabbaticals at companies where people could go off for a few months, they could go learn great things, and then they would come back, and probably they would, maybe even if a company said, hey, just enjoy your time off, but come back with 1 or 2 or 3 ideas about what will improve our business. And that would be kind of huge. That would be fun for me.
That's a wonderful idea. Maybe that should be in the next version of your book as a piece of advice. So in your opinion, what is one thing the world needs right now?
Well, I think the world needs, I guess the one word I would say is leadership. I know you don't want a one-word answer, but I guess if I were to say something, I would say servant leadership. I would say get involved. The world is a complete mess right now for a lot of different reasons. But I think if people, I guess if I have one word, I would say engagement. Get engaged with the world, the society. Do something. There's a great quote. I hope I'll get it right. Let's see. Give me a moment here. I'm trying to remember the exact thing, but it's basically along the lines of if you like bad things happen when good people do nothing. I think it's somewhere along those lines.
Yes, right.
So I think that would be my thing.
Good. I love that. Being engaged and sort of standing up for principles. I think this divisiveness in our society is really fostering that. So question 3, if you were back at school today thinking about starting your career, what would you want to be when you grew up?
I think I'd want to be what I kind of do now, because I think that when you're talking about my bio about 1 + 1 = 3, that actually that comes from Bruce Springsteen. I'm a Springsteen fan.
Yeah.
He's just talking about the magic of life is like when 1 + 1 = 3. And Bono has a song where he says uno, dos, tres, catorce, 14 in Spanish. So it's like the magic that you can create is when you're creating these environments. And that's kind of exciting to me, is like the magic that you can create. So that's kind of why I like doing what I'm doing, or when I get the opportunity. A lot of times the organizational culture is not in tune with that, but I try to change that. But I think that's what I would want to do, is kind of do something similar.
Yeah.
Maybe, but I'd like to go back to school and have the wisdom I have now that took me to gain over the last 30 years.
Wouldn't we all? Yeah. Well, it's very cool that you can see from the passion you have for for your work, that you're very well suited for doing what you do today. So it's no surprise you have
thank you.
what you're doing. So let me ask you number 4, what hobby or activity outside of your work brings you joy?
Well, the one that comes to mind right now, since I'm somewhat isolated and spend a lot of time at home, I'm doing a lot of stuff in the yard, like, gardening. Like I bought, a whole bunch of different things, like vegetables, and like I'm growing mint, and I'm growing like cantaloupes, and the other usual things like cucumbers and peppers and things. I'm also planting some different hedges and things, and that's kind of fun. It's like, in some sense, it's like you see the growth and stuff. It's pretty remarkable to see that. And if you kind of have a parallel to organizations, maybe that's why, like, I think a lot of people really enjoy gardening and working in their yard because they see the impact. I just wish we could translate that more over to organizations as well.
Yeah, if leaders could be more nurturing, we might have a better place to work, right?
There we go. Yeah. The gardening leader or something.
Now, I might know the answer to this next question because I'm not going to say why, but what person, living or dead, has inspired you the most?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I used to answer it this way, and I still do, I suppose. There's the 2 people I've mentioned. So one of them is Russell Acuff, the other one's Bruce Springsteen.
I figured it'd be Russell.
Yeah. And that's funny because I talked to Russ about Bruce Springsteen. He's like, oh, that's like noise and stuff like that, which is kind of funny because of the era he grew up in. But Russell Acuff is selfless. He was amazing. He wrote 30 books. He's brilliant. Check him out on YouTube.
Yeah.
Springsteen, you go to a show, and it's not just Springsteen. There's other people too. There's plenty of artists, but you look and see the enthusiasm that they have for the work that they do, and then the joy that it brings to their listeners or their followers or their viewers. And it's just remarkable, and it's inspiring to say, hey, it makes you want to go and say, I want to do that where I am. Now, just to tie it back to engagement and disengagement, you have to change the culture, and you have to do a number of things. Otherwise, it's sort of frustrating. But I think the more people that get in that mindset, the more then, people are going to feel that joy that people like an Acuff or a Springsteen feel when they're performing for people.
And my last question, what is the last thing you read?
What's the last thing I read? Well, I mean, I guess like I can't really say that it's one book per se, because I have like a stack of like probably 20 books in my bedroom. Let's see. I'm going to try. I'm reading. I'm going to try not to get political in this because that's one that's popping into my head. I might have to mention it because that's the only one that's coming to my head right now. I don't know whether.
Go ahead.
So there's a guy named Dan Pfeiffer. He has a book called Untrumping America, and so basically, you can read into the title about some of the problems, but I think if we want to go beyond the specifics of like, if we don't want to get political and stuff, I think the thing is, it's really about creating a society with integrity and a place where we're not so divisive. So I think that for whatever reason, over a period of decades, the country has become very divisive. And I think that there's people that previously, maybe 50 years ago, might have had an interesting dialogue about their viewpoints and things. And now it's gotten to the point where it's almost impossible to have a dialogue. And so some of the things in the book are really around creating a society where it's not so divisive and where people find the common interests and things like that. And so you can move forward. And I don't see like a house divided is will not stand. And I think that, right now, like our country, United States, is pretty divided. So I think there's a number of things that are remedies for reducing the division, but that's going to take years or decades to kind of undo a lot of the damage that we've had. So anyway, that's one of the ones that comes to mind. And I want to, see, I might have particular views, but I think that inclusiveness is really important. And maybe like, the sort of, we can create that engagement and the civility as a country by like learning and kind of creating mechanisms for us to be able to come together again.
Great. Well, Jason, thank you so much for being my guest today. It's always a pleasure to share conversations with you and to learn from you. And it's been tremendous to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
So my guest today has been Jason Magidson, business process engineer, consultant, author, and speaker in the area of creating and sustaining employee engagement. My thanks today to Dan Shields for engineering today's program. My name is Steve Hart, and this is the Learning Aloud podcast from the Organizational Dynamics community at the University of Pennsylvania.